My daughter-in-law laughed at my dress at my husband's funeral. She smirked, loud enough that people turned their heads. She had no idea who I really was. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed and tell me where you're watching this story from. My name is Elaine Porter. I taught high school literature for 30 years, and for most of that time, I shared a life with a man named Thomas. Quiet, steady, and the kind of presence that anchored a house. We lived simply but well. We loved the small things. The way Thomas brewed a cup of coffee exactly the same way every morning. The way he left a note on my pillow if he had to leave early. The way he would sit and listen to me think aloud over trivial frustrations. He liked tidy things. I liked color. We balanced one another. The accident took him on an ordinary Thursday in late October. A delivery truck lost control on the highway and crossed the median. There are official phrases for things like that. No time to react, instantaneous fatality. A tragedy beyond words. Those words are polite. They do not unwrap themselves and make room in your chest the way grief does. They do not tell you how to breathe through breakfasts where you expect his cup to steam at the place he always sat. After the funeral, I wore black for weeks, as people suggested. Black is supposed to be simple, unremarkable, an armor of absence. The house felt like a room with a window boarded over. I kept his shirts folded in a drawer near my bedside for months because they smelled faintly of him. I kept the calendar that had our anniversaries circled in his handwriting. I planted 2 rose bushes outside the kitchen window because the yard looked wrong without anything flowering. Our son, Michael, tried to help. He is practical in a way I admire and sometimes resent. He organized paperwork, met with the insurance adjusters, put together the memorial. He did not, however, live in the slow, raw fog of someone who's lost a spouse. He lives with a life to run, and that's as it should be, but it left space between us that neither of us knew how to cross. A year after the funeral, Michael introduced us to his fiancée, Tiffany. She was 26, elegant, bright, with a laugh like a bell and clothes that seemed to arrive before she did. She wore labels Michael did not know how to pronounce. She made friends quickly and filled empty chairs at parties with stories and an easy smile. We had dinner a few times. She was warm and funny and sometimes painfully frank. At first, I liked her frankness. After a while, it felt like commentary about a blouse, about the color of the curtains, about my habit of keeping 2 different teacups in the sink. None of it felt cruel. It felt observational. I told myself that she was young, that she was finding her footing in a family where a man's absence still echoed in the corners. I never expected the funeral, though. Life has a way of placing us on stages we didn't audition for. The funeral was at St. Mark's, a small church on the hill with stained glass, catching light at the wrong hour. I thought I knew how I would behave, sit straight, listen, answer the condolences with the practiced politeness grief demands. I had chosen my outfit for days, modest, black, a silk blend the color of the shadow on dusk. It was simple by design, not attention-grabbing. But grief has a way of making you hyper-visible and invisible at the same time. People expect you to perform sorrow. People also use your performance as an opportunity to measure and judge. When Tiffany arrived, she wore something that looked like a proclamation. Velvet, bright emerald, a dress with a neckline designed to make people look. I caught Michael's brief, awkward smile and then a look that said, "Don't." She sat 2 pews over from me, fanning herself with a program like she was already bored. Midway through the service, during the quiet when the minister asked for a moment of reflection, Tiffany leaned toward the woman next to her and whispered something. The woman giggled. A few heads turned. One of the giggles rippled into a small chorus. I kept my hands folded. I didn't want to make a scene. I had learned the economy of grief. Conserve your energy for the things that will last, like memory. But her whisper was audible enough that the laughter spread. Somebody in the back began to cough to cover a laugh, and then she said it. Bright, clear, careless. Who wakes up like this and thinks that is funeral black? She gestured with a lipsticked finger toward me, the gesture sharp and small and intended to be private. It wasn't. It landed like a pebble that found the stillness of a pond. At that moment, I understood two things. First, she intended to humiliate me. Second, she had no idea what she was poking at. Her laugh struck people as cheeky. To me, it was a blade. The room shifted. I felt the weight of eyes. I turned and saw Michael's face, pained, a muscle working in his jaw. I saw a few townspeople glance away as if embarrassed for her. Then I heard someone else say, not loud but audible, "Be nicer." Tiffany's face tightened, and she looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. I did not react, but I remember with crystalline clarity the way the sunlight through the stained glass cut the air, and how that light fell across my hands, folded on my lap. People think funerals are governed by reverence. They are also governed by the social rules of being seen. I felt seen and diminished in one breath. Afterwards, there was the ritual of condolences, the cataloging of who said what, and the performances of affection we all take turns delivering. People stood in a line to offer platitudes. Tiffany approached like a comet, smirking at nothing in particular, leaning in and offering, "Your dress, Mrs. Porter, did you raid a vintage store? It's so unique, designed to wound, delivered as a joke." Michael's face collapsed with a private grief that did not belong to me. He asked her quietly to be kind. She smirked and moved on. The rest of the day felt like an echo chamber of that one sentence. I went home and sat at my kitchen table alone, the light of late afternoon giving everything a honeyed glaze, and I remembered words my mother used to say, "An insult tells you who they are. A reaction tells them who you are." I told myself I would show no reaction. I told myself I would live as if unbuckled by someone else's opinion. What I did not tell myself was how small the comment made me feel, not because of its truth, but because of its timing and intent. Funerals are supposed to be the places where kindness is easiest and cruelty costs a person something. To be cut in that quiet room was to have your grief cheapened. I wanted to teach a lesson, not from a place of revenge, but from a place of reclamation. I wanted the world to see that the person she mocked had more than she imagined. The next day, Michael called with a voice that held an edge I'd seldom heard since his father died. "She's invited us to a brunch tomorrow," he said, "at her mother's club. She said it would be informal, but she wants to apologize." He said the words like he needed them to be true. I told him I didn't want apologies performed in the glow of a social event. "If she's sorry, she can come here," I said. "Sit with me." "Say it like you mean it." He hesitated. "Mom, she asked me to help plan a memorial event. It has to be..." I felt the old protective thing in me for Michael, like an automatic reflex. "If she's going to be around my life," I said, "I will not let her treat me like a footnote." The brunch was scheduled for Saturday at a country club a few miles away. When I arrived, Tiffany was already there, flitting in fabrics and laughter, everyone around her clustered like bees. She wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and the gesture felt like armor. People spoke politely, small talk, the kind that polishes edges. She came over with a drink in hand, and for a moment I imagined she might simply apologize and close the story. Instead, she opened her mouth and said, "Mrs. Porter, you look so theatrical today. The dress, I mean, it belonged to another century." She laughed at that last word. The laugh was designed to be shared. A silence fell in my chest that felt like a thing I could hold. I studied her face the way a woman studies a coin to decide if it's counterfeit. She was young. Her jaw was stiff with rehearsed smiles. Her eyes were quick to move to others to see if her lines landed. There's a way to read a person's cruelty. You can see what it's built on. Insecurity, hunger to mark territory, maybe a fear that someone older will outshine. I raised my teacup to my lips and said slowly, "Tiffany, I hope you enjoy the club's scones. They're remarkable. Mrs. Patel's recipe." My voice was calm, the kind of calm that is not numbness, but careful devotion to a plan. She blinked at the mention of Mrs. Patel and looked over. "Oh, Mrs. Patel is lovely." Her tone suggested an impatience to move on. I had come with a purpose that had nothing to do with a public spectacle. I had come because years ago, on a quiet Thursday night not long before Thomas died, he had given me a packet of papers, legal documents folded into a blue envelope and tied with a ribbon, that he whispered I should open only if anything happened to him. He had been particular about these things: the choice of executor, the small bequests, his preferences for tea leaves. I had kept that envelope in a drawer beneath his shirts for nearly a year before I finally opened it. Thomas had been practical to the last. He left a letter that was mostly apologies for trivial things he thought he should have done better, and in the back, a list of accounts and a set of instructions about a business venture he had quietly supported for years. The reason we had lived comfortably, the reason we did not have to sell the house when his life ended. It was a small portfolio held in the name of a trust, something that would ensure we could keep our life and pass on small gifts to the people who mattered. He was modest in the way he had done it. He never wanted attention for his prudence. I had told no one, not Michael, not my sister, not Tiffany. I had felt embarrassed by money, unsure of what virtue it could buy in a moment like this. I had kept the knowledge private because it felt like something sacred between Thomas and me. Standing at the brunch, watching Tiffany make sport of me, I felt the truth rise like light through something clouded. It was not the money that made me consider action. It was the idea that someone could hurt you in public and leave no consequences. That day, I decided to make it very clear that consequences existed, not as a spectacle, but as a correction. I did not plot revenge. I planned an unveiling. I would give Tiffany a chance to apologize again, this time to choose sincerity or to reveal herself as petty. I would place the truth somewhere obvious, yet graceful. I would not humiliate her, but I would not let her arrogance go unmeasured. That evening, I called an old friend, Margaret, who had been a trustee on many charitable boards and had a reputation for elegant discretion. Margaret loved ceremonies and had a way of making formal announcements feel like kindness. "I have an idea," she said when I told her everything, and her idea was the kind of gentle weapon I needed. She would arrange a luncheon that would include patrons of the arts and the small local press, people who understood public acknowledgments. Margaret promised to orchestrate a reveal that would be tasteful and final. "You want the truth to look like a gift," she said, "not a sting." People remember gifts I felt both childish and perfectly adult as I prepared. I found a black suit that made me feel like a person again, sharp, tidy, not the dull armor of mourning, but the kind of black that lives well among others. When Saturday came, Margaret's luncheon had exactly the audience I needed: cultured, curious, and importantly, inclined to notice when someone's biography changed. Tiffany arrived late, as she usually did, with flowers in one arm and a smile that smoothed everything into fashion. She saw me across the room and made a soft, dismissive face, the way someone crosses their hand over a blemish. She intended no malice exactly. Malice isn't so deliberate. Instead, she had crafted a persona that left nobody in doubt that she expected the world to conform to her shorthand. Margaret called for a moment, and the room quieted. She had a small plaque on an easel. She spoke of local benefactors and the quiet people who make an arts community possible. She did not give names at first. She let impressions hang like silver trays on a table. Then Margaret turned and said, "We have a patron to recognize today who has been behind the scenes for years, supporting scholarships for young readers and funding the restoration of our local theater. She asked to remain anonymous, but some things deserve acknowledgement in daylight." She smiled like sunlight and unfolded an envelope. "Elaine Porter," she said. "When tragedies strike and people think to tisk about grief as if it were a costume, sometimes a quiet life bears more weight than the loud. Today we thank Elaine Porter for a decade of unassuming philanthropy." The room erupted in polite applause, the kind that carries real warmth when it is surprised by truth. Tiffany's smile thinned. The air in the room altered. Faces turned, and someone whispered, "The Porters? The ones who kept the bookstore on Maple?" My palms clung to the program like an anchor. I had not expected the print. Margaret had prepared a small statement that included some facts about the trust and the little scholarships Thomas and I had funded under Margaret's advice. Micro grants for literature students, a fund for a children's reading program, a clandestine renovation of the theater's junior seating. The press would pick this up, perhaps. That did not matter to me. The reveal was not about showmanship. It was about making the truth visible. Quiet generosity exists. Tiffany's face flushed, then paled. She managed to laugh, a small, forced sound. "How nice," she said, and there was a bitterness to the syllables. People began to look at her, the same people who had smiled politely at her previous jests, but now their gazes were different. They saw layers. They saw that her dismissal had been premature. It was not revenge that warmed me in that moment. It was relief. It felt like someone returning a lost object to you, dignity. But this was not the end. The luncheon planted a seed. It rearranged who understood what, and more quietly where people would take their cues in future interactions. That night, Tiffany called Michael and said she would like to make amends. Michael relayed the message to me with the weary tone of a man trying to mediate the unmediable. "She seemed sincere," he said. I told him to give her a chance. I told him further, sincerity is not measured by a single sentence. Let her prove herself. The days that followed were subtle. The community began to speak differently about us, not in a way that made headlines, but in the way neighbors nod with a new recognition when you pass. I returned to the routines that kept me anchored. School, coffee in the mornings, the walk that took me past the river where the light likes to be cinematic. Tiffany reached for reconciliation in small ways. She invited me to a charity gala as a guest of honor, an invitation which felt like a test more than a kindness. Michael was uncertain. "She thinks she can buy her way into being forgiven," he said. "But maybe that's her thing. Work with the money she knows." I did not want to be rude. I accepted. I intended to behave like the adult I had been trained to be. At the gala, the lighting was generous, gilded. The orchestra warmed the space with old standards. Tiffany was attentive and polite. She introduced me as if she were bridging an aesthetic chasm to show me to the right people. Whatever attempts she made to be gracious, there was something unfinished in her manner. It felt like a practiced reconciliation. I could see it as clearly as I could see the moon over the river. Then a conversation at the gala shifted things toward the practical, and someone mentioned a local jewelry boutique that had recently closed. The owner, a woman named Janice, had retired abruptly, and her store, an understated, well-curated place, had been sold. People speculated quietly about who might take over, who might get the lease. It is strange how people talk in the margins. An innocuous remark about shops can be a keyhole to the private life of a stranger. That night, I learned that Tiffany had taken an interest in the boutique. She had plans, sources whispered. She had been spotted with a developer. It was the sort of thing people say aloud with glee. the small rumor flickering like an ember. The rumor suggested ambition. Ambition, when combined with untempered manners, can make a person dangerous to themselves and to others. A week later, I walked past the boutique and, hidden in the window among displays of costume, jewelry, and bridal trinkets, saw a poster. Grand reopening. New management. Tiffany's name was not listed, but the timing suggested something had shifted in the undercurrent. I felt a strange prickle, an impulse that a person gets when they sense an actor in a play is about to overreach. Then the call came. Janice wanted to meet me. She had heard about the luncheon and, perhaps wanting to be polite to a neighbor, invited me for tea. Janice was undecorated in speech and manner, the way some houses are undecorated. Neat. Honest. She told me she had sold the boutique to a company and would remain on in a consultant role during the transition. She told me she had met Tiffany and found her charming, funny, and decisive. Then she paused and added, "There is a clause, though. The boutique wants to be local. They want roots. They wanted someone who understands books." Her eyes met mine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She smiled, small. "We're starting a book and gift section." The papers were hard to sign unless there was someone who knew the literature side. They asked if you might consult. They said someone in the community suggested I went home that afternoon with a paper cup of tea and a head full of the clatter of small businesses, shelves, ribbons, the smell of new paint. Someone had nominated me and Janice had agreed. The boutique had asked politely for a name to legitimize a particular local flavor. When I told Michael, he was incredulous. "Mom, are you serious?" he said. "You would help her?" His incredulity was part admiration and part worry. "You'd be working with the woman who made a mockery of you at his funeral." I realized in that moment that I had two choices. I could refuse and watch the story become one of long bitterness, two people occupying the same small town in separate orbits. Or I could accept and place myself where I had influence, not for the sake of showing her wrong, but to create an environment where young patrons might come to love literature again. I told Michael I would meet with Janice and take a look. When I walked into the boutique for the first time under its new management, someone I did not expect greeted me. Tiffany. She had changed the store's interior with a strange mixture of taste and haste, placing mirrored candles in places that caught the light too bright. There was an awkwardness about us that week, two actors circling a stage. People asked me how things were going, and I responded with the candor of someone who knew her lines. "We're arranging the stock," I would say. "We're building a young readers program." Tiffany would smile like someone practicing a new expression. But not everyone in town liked the idea that a young woman of her background might preside over a boutique that had, until its sale, been the province of an older generation. Small resentments stir like wind under leaves. We are all complicit in our judgments. The difference between me and others was that I had the chance to shape a narrative towards something that served more than ego. And yet, while I sought to make something useful, I observed Tiffany measure and restructure in ways that suggested she was more interested in the numbers than the shop. She planned events that favored the flashy and the expensive. She contracted with a developer who promised to franchise if the launch numbers were strong. Some of her decisions worried me, losing the local crafters in favor of glossy imports, choosing advertising that screamed status over story. I raised these concerns quietly. One afternoon, I discovered invoices tucked in a drawer, paperwork left by Janice where the numbers were arranged like stepping stones. There were discrepancies, small, suspiciously timed invoices to a company linked to the developer. My chest tightened as if someone had placed a hand on my sternum. I called Margaret. She listened, then said simply, "Let's look deeper." Margaret's calm made a path. She introduced me to a woman named Vera, who had once worked in accounting for small businesses. Vera was patient. She and I sat amid the shop's boxes and receipts, and we traced a line of money that bent in ways that suggested profit extraction. There were transfer payments whose descriptions were vague. When we compared dates, the transfers coincided with Tiffany's visits to potential franchising partners. It was not illegal in the sense the police would come knocking. It was the kind of thing that happens when ambition runs the clerk's ledger rather than the owner's heart. It was the slow erosion of a community's unique voice. When I told Janice, she looked at me with the tiredness of someone who has been burned by small betrayals. "I wish I'd seen this sooner," she said. "I would have asked different questions." I felt the old instinct to protect, rooted in values, not vengeance. Maybe this was the story's true test. Could I act not to humiliate, but to preserve the thing I loved? The boutique belonged to a neighborhood that loved books. If it became a franchise, it would lose its voice. The town would lose another small place where stories were more important than profit. I decided, with Margaret and Vera's help, to gather proof that would persuade Janice's board and the small trust that managed the boutique's merchant agreements. We compiled invoices, emails, the vague contracts that hinted at a franchise clause tucked under the promise of expansion. It was meticulous, dull work, paper, and patience. The plot was not to trap Tiffany in a public humiliation. The plot was to show the owner that the boutique could be preserved as a local treasure if the right decisions were made. But in doing so, we could not deny that Tiffany's behavior at the funeral had been a symptom. A person can change, and many do. My goal was not to show the town what a shallow person she was. It was to protect a culture from being consumed. That evening, when Margaret suggested we request a meeting with Janice and the boutique's new oversight board, I felt a cold excitement that was not malicious. It was just the slow building of a necessary consequence. The truth had a runway now. The meeting room upstairs at the boutique smelled faintly of lemon polish and new paper. Janice had invited the oversight group and also, carefully, Tiffany. The intent was to discuss future directions, but there was nothing ordinary about a group of small-town stewards learning that the finances were being steered toward cold expansion. I presented the documents like an archivist. There were numbers and dates and small notations in my handwriting. I did not look at Tiffany while I spoke. My voice did not rise. It steadied like a hand on a wheel. We walked through the evidence, pointing out transfers that now seemed to form a pattern. The oversight group, made of neighbors who had kept this shop alive for decades, shifted in their seats. Someone said softly, "This wasn't what we imagined." Tiffany's face went white. She attempted to speak, then stopped. "It's not what it looks like," she said. Her voice trembled and for the first time sounded like someone who had misread the map. Margaret put a gentle hand to the table. "We can fix this without scandal," she said. "We can craft terms that ensure local partners are prioritized, that any expansion includes clear protections for the craft vendors." But the group's confidence faltered at the thought that the boutique had a path to become something else entirely. Janice's eyes were tired in the way people are when they have learned betrayal in many small pieces. "We made an agreement in good faith," she said, "but we need someone on the ground who understands this community, not someone looking for the next grand opening." Tiffany tried to say she had meant well. She pleaded about being ambitious and wanting growth and bringing attention. She said the right words to try to soften the room, but there was a tone that betrayed her, a belief that profit justified the methods. It was then that Michael, who had been quiet until now, stood up. He had been watching, a kind of hollow anger hollowed into something sharpened. "She mocked my mother at my father's funeral," he said. The statement fell into the room like a bell. It was not evidence of the financials. It was a moral detail. He wasn't shaming her so much as explaining why trust had been fractured. Tiffany's cheeks flushed. She tried to explain herself. She spoke fast and with the fluster of someone on the defensive. That was a stupid thing to say. I'm sorry, I really am, but that doesn't... Sorry is repair if it is followed by change, Janice said. We signed papers saying we trusted good judgment. That trust is what we must restore. Margaret then proposed a path, a remediation plan. The boutique would run a community board for 3 months where decisions were made transparently. A portion of profit would be allocated back to local artisans. Tiffany would remain involved but under a mentorship program, an apprenticeship to the craft of community stewardship. In the pause that followed, Tiffany's posture told the story. She could accept the path and learn, a humbling that might make her better, or she could refuse and walk toward the shine of franchising elsewhere. The board wanted to preserve the boutique as a cultural place, not a business model to be replicated mindlessly. The room held its breath, like someone waiting for rain. Tiffany looked at me then. For a second, I saw the impression she had of me, a woman of a certain age, a relic of some old order. She opened her mouth and then closed it. I had no desire to inflict a spectacular humiliation. I wanted change. I wanted to offer the world a better option than spectacle. She exhaled, thin and brittle. I'll do it, she said. I'll learn. It sounded small. It sounded real. It sounded like the beginning of a person's possibility. The oversight board made a decision that afternoon. Place limits, require transparency, form a mentorship program. They asked me to serve as a senior advisor to the community board, an acknowledgement I accepted with the kind of caution one gives to a new bridge. It was not a triumph. It was a stewardship. Later, when I sat alone on the boutique's back steps, I let the afternoon's heat wrap around me. I thought about how easily we conflate visibility with value. I thought about the cost of making a person pay for a mistake with their life. I had wanted the world to notice that my life was not one to be mocked. I had also wanted, in a quieter place, to make room for someone to learn that words could wound. Perhaps the nuanced victory was that Tiffany stayed and learned, because sometimes a person's better self is a choice they make when given a mirror and a chance. That evening, Michael said simply, "Mom, you handled that with dignity." I pressed my hand to my chest. "I did what I could," I said. "There are different kinds of justice. Some are loud, some are gentle." The months that followed were not cinematic in the way headlines pretend. They were small and steady. We convened the community board. We reorganized book sections, reshelved local authors, invited school children for reading hours, and established a stipend for craft vendors. Tiffany kept her place but did not move at the first opportunity to franchise. She learned inventory systems and customer relationships. She learned, against her previous inclinations, the subtle art of listening. She apologized to me, privately one afternoon between orders of scones and cups of tea. Her apology was not a performance. She spoke like a person who had been made awkward by consequence and was humble enough to admit it. "I was thoughtless," she said. "You were grieving, and I made light. I was cruel for a moment I should have never taken. I'm sorry those words were simple. They were not a cure for the wound of that funeral day, but they were a stitch. I accepted. Forgiveness in practice is not always sentimental. It is a decision to let a person carry their shame in a better way. Over the year, Tiffany changed. Not in the way of overnight redemption stories. She altered like someone learning to use a different muscle. She became better at introducing local artisans, better at promoting events that were not about profit but about community. She grew to care, in a grown-up way, about the bookstore's modest needs. She even began to read aloud during the children's hour in a way that the children liked. There is nothing more humbling than reading to 8-year-olds and realizing they measure you for truth, not for display. My life recovered its texture. I returned to teaching with a steadier hand. I graded essays with more clarity. Students who had come to the book program showed up in my classroom with a new curiosity. The roses outside the kitchen continued to bloom. Money and position had not cured me of grief. They could not. But they had allowed me to choose how I showed up in the world. One rainy afternoon, soft and familiar, I caught Tiffany in the back of the boutique arranging a shelf. She looked up and smiled at me, not with the old practice smile, but with a relieved inner smile, the kind of grin you get when you've finished a hard piece of work and understand that the labor itself is its own reward. We stood there side by side, arranging titles so that an author's voice might find the reader who needed it. I thought about that chapel and about the small humiliation that had sparked so many things. I thought about my husband and how he never sought applause for his quiet acts. He would have found the irony of it all delicious, that his secret thriftiness might bring a young woman to learn the virtue of community. One evening, Michael sat with me and said softly, "Dad would be proud of what you did here, how you turned something that hurt into something that helped." I smiled at the memory of Thomas and the way his eyes would go soft when he was pleased. "He always wanted us to live well," I said, "not just in comfort, but in how we treat others." What had begun as a moment of painful exposure had matured into a lesson that would bind the boutique, the town, and the people who stepped through its door. Small kindnesses, like small investments, compound. The boutique began to host readings from local poets. The scholarship we had funded through Thomas's trust awarded a small grant to a young woman who wanted to publish a pamphlet of rural stories. Those were the quiet returns on the choices we had made. The final sweet thing that happened, months after the initial clash, was something trivial and human. Tiffany and I were setting out chairs in the back of the store for a reading when she turned to me, hands flurry from moving paperbacks, and said, with a softness I hadn't heard from her before, "Thank you for staying." I wanted to say, in return, "Thank you for learning." Instead, I hugged her. Awkward because we are not people who hug publicly in our town, and felt the comforting press of human contact. It was not an absolution. It was a recognition that people can be remade by the right constraints and the right chances. If this story moved you, tell me which city you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe so you don't miss the next real-life story. Sometimes dignity is not shouted. Sometimes it is the small, steady work of keeping a place alive. Sometimes the most powerful answer to cruelty is to offer a better alternative: patience, presence, and a willingness to shape the future instead of delivering a spectacle. With love and respect, Elaine Porter.